entire life. I think he began to seriously consider it in the 1970s. In fact, the first documented case I found of him explaining to people, essentially outside of his family, that he wanted to run for president was when he was in China. Something that he was going to come back and do either in 76 or in 1980. Clearly, he was a person who always thought he should be in charge. He was an alpha male in the extreme. But he also, I think, thought it was probably by the 1970s a realistic proposition that he would never be the inside candidate, but that perhaps he would be able to come in from the outside.
So when did he first run?
First ran in 1980. Actually, just to go back to his CIA days, when President Carter wins in 1976, Bush actually asked him if he could stay on at the CIA. Carter wanted his own CIA director, so Bush spends the next 3 years essentially prepping for his run in 1980. Goes back to Houston, but really spends most of his time on the road, meeting people in all the different states. And 1980 is when he finally ran against Ronald Reagan. Was ultimately the best first challenge against Reagan, in the sense that Bush managed to win the Iowa caucuses. Ronald Reagan at that point had assumed he was going to steamroll to the convention. That was conventional wisdom, and really didn't put too much time into Iowa. And Bush made a point of visiting every single county in Iowa and shaking hands there. He wins the Iowa caucus, and frankly, it's downhill from there once Reagan gets his full attention in the campaign, if you will. And Bush winds up being essentially the last man standing against Ronald Reagan, and in fact gives us some of our most important historical phrases, if you will, and criticisms about Ronald Reagan. Bush, for example, is the one who comes up on the campaign trail with the term voodoo economics to describe trickle-down economics, or supply side, as Reagan would have preferred. We still use the term voodoo economics today, and we forget that it ultimately was Reagan's vice president who used that as a criticism against him when they were both going for the top job.
What was their personal relationship before he was picked to be the vice presidential candidate with Ronald Reagan?
You know, before he was picked to be vice presidential candidate, I would argue they had no relationship except for a somewhat antagonistic one. They were not close in any way. I'm not even sure how often they had been together except on the campaign trail at different events, something that doesn't necessarily breed camaraderie when you're finally competitors. The 1980 convention was a weird one historically, because there began to be talk that perhaps Ronald Reagan would choose Gerald Ford to come back and be his vice president. They would essentially be co-presidents. And tensions got very close before both sides realized this would never work, that somebody had to be in charge ultimately. And Reagan then had to turn and find someone to be vice president, and the logical choice was the next man up. That is, the one who had been last man standing in the campaign, George Bush. And it's a testament, I think, to both men, both their sense of opportunism and also their basic character, that they were willing to look past the criticisms of the primary campaign to work together over the next 8 years.
What was your reaction when you saw that Roger Ailes became a close confidant and advisor to George H.W. Bush?
You know, Bush had a remarkable ability throughout his career, especially when he got into national level politics, of being able to surround himself with people who would do, frankly, the dirty work that needs to get done for an election as he saw it. Lee Atwater, Roger Ailes, people who would play politics, I don't want to say dirty might not be the right word, but play top politics as tough as possible. Okay, I'll use the word dirty. And Bush would always have a sense of remove, that he could say, I did not order that, I did not know about that plan, I didn't know about Willie Horton, for example, despite the fact that his campaign clearly knew that the Willie Horton ad was going to run, the Willie Horton being the famous racially charged advertisement that the Bush campaign ran in 1988. There was always somebody around him, essentially, who could be the hitman. Ailes and people like Atwater played that role for him.
Why did you believe George Bush when he said he did not know about the Willie Horton ad?
Because I've seen no documentation that he did, and I've seen documentation from people like Atwater in particular, who said we made a point of not discussing such things. This is not to alleviate Bush of any complicity or guilt in these situations. He was in charge. He is responsible for what happens with his campaign. But it does give a sense of the tone that he wanted to set. As he's told his people, we're going to go for the win. We're going to do whatever it takes to win. We're going to play dirty and, in many ways, both play the race card and try to emasculate Michael Dukakis, their campaign opponent. He wanted those things done, but he wanted somebody else to do it.
As you know, many stories have been written over the years that when Ronald Reagan was president, that George Bush, as vice president, was not invited to the private quarters. They had no time together except for their lunches that they had. Is that a true story? And did you ask the president about that?
That is a true story, and I have to admit I never asked the president about that, because the more interesting aspect for me would have been asking Ronald Reagan, which unfortunately I never had the chance to do. George Bush was not the only person who didn't make it into the residence when Reagan was president. Essentially no one made it into the residence when Reagan was president. Ronald Reagan is, I think, of all of our presidents, perhaps the greatest personal enigma. He was gregarious, but really liked to spend time by himself, or at the very least with Nancy, his wife. Their typical evening was to eat TV dinners, or at least on a TV tray, and watch old movies together, just the two of them. That was how they liked to be. So one could never get too close to Ronald Reagan, and believe me, George and Barbara Bush tried. He thought if we could make the Reagans into our friends, that would help us professionally and politically, and make a nicer work environment. Ronald Reagan didn't have friends in that way. He had many close acquaintances. Nobody who, I think, besides Nancy, that we could really call a true friend.
What are the chances that George Herbert Walker Bush would have been elected president if he hadn't been selected by Ronald Reagan as his vice president?
You know, I've never considered that question. I think he would have entered, let's presume that Reagan wins in 1984. He would have entered the 88 election as, one of a pack of people who would be running for president. And at that point, actually, as I think about it more, he would have been in pretty good stead, because one of the remarkable things about the Republican primary in 1987-88 is just how far most of the candidates on that field are trying to run away from the legacy of Reagan. We think of Reagan, of course, through the lens of history as someone who was remarkably popular at the end. He was personally popular, but his policies were not so, especially his policies vis-a-vis the Cold War. And he still had the taint of Iran-Contra as well. So most of the candidates were trying to essentially criticize Reagan's legacy. And I think given his experience in 1980, had Bush not been a member of the administration, he would have been first in line to criticize Reagan in 1988.
You start your book by telling a story about George Bush and a man named Gorbachev. Here's some video from the interview in 1998. When was the first time you met him?
I met him when I was vice president. When he assumed office, the day he assumed office, I was the guy that in those days went to a lot of funerals over there. I was vice president. And I cabled back to Ronald Reagan, this man is different. Here's a much more open, much more frank, much less inclined to turn to his aides to tell him what to say, much less programmed.
Why did you start your book with a Gorbachev story?
First of all, I think the book is fundamentally about the Cold War, or the end of the Cold War, and I think it's silly to think that any one person is responsible for ending the Cold War, but if you had to choose somebody who is more responsible than anyone else, it would be Mikhail Gorbachev. He is really the central catalyst that gets the entire explosion started, the democratic explosion. His desire to reform the Soviet Union, not to eradicate it. He was a true Soviet believer, but to reform it and revitalize it, set in motion ultimately the democratic revolutions that brought down his country's empire. And Bush's interaction with him was critical, and it was fascinating to me that Bush, this is in 1987, when I described their first limousine ride, it was after their first meeting, but their first limousine ride together in Washington, D.C., Gorbachev was arguably the most famous man in the world. And Bush was trying to become the most powerful man in the world, but the odds were, well, not so much stacked against him, but he was clearly uncertain at that point if he was going to be able to get the Republican nomination. And the idea that you have this incredibly popular rock star of a foreign leader more embraced by the American people than their own vice president was a dramatic moment for me.
The diary, how much of that did you read?
I've read his entire diary for periods before his presidency. I haven't actually read all the excerpts of his diary during his presidency. My understanding is that they're going to be released upon his passing. The diary from his time in China